is my actual first Black Christian.
Good evening.
Right.
Hello. How is everyone?
All right.
All right. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I am Michael Denzel Smith. I will be your moderator for this evening for what is sure to be a very enlightening, lively conversation. I will go around and allow the panelists to introduce themselves with appropriate gender pronouns that are preferred here and all affiliations that you want to be known and why you are here today. So we'll start with.
Sure. My name is Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. I'm an assistant professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. I'm also the author of a book that just came out in January called From Black Lives Matter, # to Black Liberation, published with Haymarket Books. And I'm here to talk about this very exciting document, Agenda to Build Black Futures.
I'm Derek Hamilton, an associate professor of economics and urban policy in the urban policy program, as well as the Department of Economics at the New School, the director of the doctoral program in public policy there. And I guess in affiliation, I'm one of the co-principal investigators on a project that's sponsored by the Ford Foundation called the National Asset Scorecard and Communities of Color Project, where we're collecting asset and debt information disaggregated from the broad categories like Black, Latino, Asian, and white and Native American to get at tribal affiliation and ancestral origin in 5 cities, so we can look at both place and disaggregation. And a real quick plug, we produced a bunch of reports. I can pass them out in the audience. One is The Color of Wealth in Los Angeles, The Color of Wealth in Boston. Another report is Beyond Broke, talking about the black-white wealth gap. And then I'm going to try to be brief and get through it. The other one is Umbrellas Don't Make It Rain While Studying and Working Hard Is Not Enough for Black Americans. I love that title, Umbrellas Don't Make It Rain. It basically is talking about causality. Is it wealth that leads to, is it education and hard work that leads to wealth, or vice versa? Does wealth give you access to education and jobs? And then there's one more that I can't find. It's probably in my bag, but I like the title, so I'll announce it. Bootstraps are for Black kids, and then there's a colon and ... But it's basically talking about attitudes towards education. So the norms is that Black people don't value education. We find that Black parents give more with less, and that when Black parents are able to give, that there's virtually no difference in educational attainment between the groups.
All right.
Just turn this around. Good evening, everyone. My name is Janae Bonsu. My gender pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm really excited to be here in Brooklyn. I was born here 25 years ago, and now I live in Chicago, and I fell in love with that city. And so it's not every day that I get to be here and have like my dad in the audience. And also shout out to New York City squad in the building, BYP100. Yeah, so for those of, I know many of you know about BYP100 already, but for those who don't, the Black Youth Project 100 is the dopest collective of 18 to 35-year-old Black activists and organizers who are all dedicated to achieving liberation in all realms, so social, political, economic, educational. And we work to achieve our freedom dreams through grassroots direct action organizing, political education, civic engagement, and policy development and advocacy, and really trying to intertwine those things into transformative campaigns that actually change our lives. And so I am honored to serve as BYP100's National Public Policy Chair, and so I am kind of tasked with co-leading the development of our policy ideas and supporting our chapters within the organization and making them into reality through grassroots campaigns. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this work. Well, one of the products of our public policy ideas, the first was the Agenda to Keep Us Safe. You can Google that. And yeah, I'm really excited about this because it was definitely a collaborative effort and a product of I think the brilliance and vision of young Black people to imagine what an economy that works for us looks like in 2016 and beyond. And you know, it started with my predecessor in this role, Terrence Laney, and was really like, it started with a Facebook post like, yo, we need to start thinking about economic justice and how it links to all of our work, and went to calls to folks, you know, volunteering to do research and offer resources and draft pieces and write pieces and edit, and now here we are, and I'm really happy to share this with the world and have been a co-author on it. So.
Hi everybody, my name is Imani Brown. I'm one of the New York City chapter co-chairs of BYP100. I think Janae did a pretty good job of explaining what we do and who we are. I am originally from Jamaica. I grew up in Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm here now. And I feel really proud to be a part of this organization, an organization that's developed not one but two agendas that are kind of built off of the imaginations of young Black people in terms of trying to vision what is possible, not just in the world and in the future, but in our lifetime. And so I'm always happy to have a space to talk about that.
All right, thank you all. So to start us off, for those who have not had a chance to read the agenda Build Black Futures, which I recommend you do, Janae is going to present for us briefly sort of just an outline of what exactly you were looking to accomplish with this agenda. What are some of the big things that you want to point out for the audience that are in there? Yeah, so please present to us the agenda to Build Black Futures.
Yeah. The Agenda to Build Black Futures, just like our first publication, The Agenda to Keep Us Safe, is an attempt to be proactive about the world that we want to see. And so just a little background, I think when you talk about policy, especially governmental policy, the last people who are on politicians' minds are young Black people. They're not thinking about us when they're putting their platforms together. Because just young Black people is just not the voting bloc or demographic that they're confident will turn out to polls and vote for them or keep them in office. And so, you know, there's this longstanding notion that Black millennials, so to speak, are politically apathetic and are just really jaded with electoral processes. And to a degree, that might be true. But I think that is in part because we don't see our issues highlighted or addressed in electoral politics. And so, you know, especially things that hit us disproportionately hard, like police brutality and impunity, like mass incarceration and criminalization, like unemployment and underemployment, you know, lacks healthcare, just to name a few. So, you know, it's really imperative that we put the issues that affect us on the political agenda. And so there are no paid lobbyists for young Black people in Congress. There is no, you know, lobbyists in state capitals or even in city halls like, listen, this is what you gotta do for Black folks, right? So we have to be our own lobby. And so the Agenda to Build Black Futures is kind of our, us putting our issues on the agenda. And this is especially timely and important with this being a presidential, or this being an election year, excuse me. Because if the primaries thus far has taught us anything, that is that the days of young Black people not holding elected officials accountable are over. Ohio and Illinois are great examples. You know, in Cook County, there were more votes for state's attorney than the president. We had a very problematic anti-Black state's attorney in Chicago, and we voted her out, not through a campaign of endorsing someone, right? Yes, snaps for that. Not through a campaign of endorsing for a candidate, but against one, right? And so that is just an example. If that's any indication of what this election year and future elections will be, then candidates and incumbents should be scared. And so yeah, the Agenda to Build Black Futures is kind of a platform to agitate elected officials and incumbents on, as well as other decision makers, right? Because we know policy doesn't just exist in government, also exists in organizations and in hyper-local institutions. And so the Agenda to Build Black Futures, we cover a broad range of topics, and it is by no means exhaustive, but just a summary, a broad overview. We do talk about the generations of systemic harm that has been done to Black people, and make the case for reparations very clear and continue that conversation. We also reaffirm the well-known fact that the United States invests an astronomical amount of resources in the prison industrial complex, and really highlight the inverse relationship between increased spending on law enforcement and increased law enforcement budgets and cuts in social services and medical care and housing and other critical needs. And really make the case that, you know, if we want to live full lives and really have a shot at thriving, then maybe we should consider divesting and eliminating profit from punishment. Not maybe, we need to do that. And we also, in continuation of a long history of Black labor organizing, assert a Workers' Bill of Rights that builds on the National Fight for 15 campaign. That there's a lot of work been done in Fight for 15 here in New York City, but goes beyond demanding a living wage and right to unionize, but also asserts that we need, you know, paid sick leave, parental leave, you know, it also asserts for a federal jobs program, baby bonds or child development accounts, eliminating race and gender wage gaps, just a whole host of 10 points that all private and public sector employers should adopt. We also talk about the long history of the demonization of Black women, particularly Black mothers, in terms of just policing Black women's reproductive freedom and blaming Black women for single parent households, and, you know, blaming Black women for the crime and all bad things that happened in our communities. And we instead say that, you know, instead of berating and scolding Black women for families not looking like this, you know, cookie cutter nuclear family, we should instead be supporting Black women by not policing reproductive freedom, but making sure that we have universal reproductive health care, as well as universal child care and investment in public schools, not to mention closing the race and gender wage gap, because Black women are definitely disproportionately affected by that. And we go on to talk about financial literacy and, like, literally and figuratively building community, the idea of cooperative economics and community land trusts, and really just kind of building alternative structures and institutions that we can thrive in. And last but not least, I think this is last but not least, we talk about supporting trans wealth and health. So, you know, anti-Black anything is very hard, just living in a you know, kind of white supremacist society. But to live at the intersection of anti-Black racism and transphobia is definitely, and I can't say this from lived experience because I'm not trans, but like the numbers don't lie. Trans folks live in disproportionate amount of poverty. They're criminalized at much higher rates. And within the prison industrial complex, they're subjected to, you know, solitary confinement for, you know, their protection, so to speak, and just really experience vast amounts of employment discrimination, housing discrimination, huge barriers to obtaining government IDs that align with their gender identity. There's so many things, and so and here we offer some recommendations to alleviate that as well. So again, a broad range of problems and solutions that I hope that we can interrogate and build on and critically engage with tonight.
Thank you. Keeanga, when I read through Agenda to Build Back Futures and listening to Janae present it right now, it calls to mind a tradition of Black organizing that is embracing of a social economic platform, right? Thinking immediately sort of A. Philip Randolph and the Freedom Budget, Black Panther Party and 10-Point Program. I mean, this is just a few examples. So could you, for us, situate the Agenda to Build Black Futures within that historical tradition and sketch that out for us a little bit, but also talk a little bit about why this is sort of abnormal now, the embrace of a socialist economic agenda within the context of Black organizing?
Sure. And I thought when I was reading through, I've read the agenda for to build a Black future or to build Black futures a few times now. And one of the two things that I did think of were the Freedom Budget, which was basically an economic component to the March on Washington in the sort of mid-1960s Black political activism that often gets narrowed into just the field of civil rights, but was much more broad. So people know that the 1963 march was the March for Jobs and Freedom, but also the 10-point plan for the Black Panther Party. And the reason, in some ways that is similar to those things is obvious, but one of the things that I thought about, especially when you were speaking, is this whole notion of freedom dreams and how social movements need to start with the question of what we want and not what is possible or not what is pragmatic. In that sense, this document certainly reflects that we're not starting with the sort of narrowed scope and the limitations that the political parties and elected officials like to impose on us, that you can choose from this handful of crumbs, but this really reflects the sort of an expansive understanding of what it would mean for Black people to have some measure of actual freedom in this society, and I think that is important. And the other aspect of this that I think makes a critical intervention in this particular moment is that police brutality has been a catalyst for Black protests since African Americans really, if we just want to look at the 20th century, since African Americans have been in urban populations. If we think about the Harlem Riot of 1935 as a sort of first modern Black rebellion in response to police violence. And again in the 1960s, 500,000 African Americans participated in some form of urban uprising in more than 200 American cities from 1963 to 1968. Or we think about the LA Rebellion in 1992. And all of these were touched off by police violence. But it would be very wrong to look at them and reduce them all to the question of police brutality, because what was beneath that were the tensions that developed, the anger and bitterness that developed around poverty, racism, unemployment, underemployment, but also issues of under-resourcing, of poor schools, poorly maintained public institutions and public facilities. And all of these were the larger issues that lie beneath police violence and police racism. And what that means today is that we have the same dynamic, that police brutality is the thing that this national movement, if we think about Black Lives Matter as a national movement, as a national phenomenon, is touched off by police violence, police brutality. But what lies beneath are these same sorts of issues, which means the reason why this is important is that it means that when there are attempts to narrow the demands around the movement to body cameras for police or sensitivity training for police or just hiring more black cops, that it misses what the larger context is for why this movement has emerged in the first place. The movement hasn't emerged in the first place because police don't wear body cameras, right? It has to do with the enormous amounts of deprivation and insecurity that exists throughout black communities. And so in that sense, the intervention that this document is making is bringing attention to that, is saying you cannot narrow our movement to these particular questions just about police, but that we have to look at what gives rise to crime, which then provides an excuse for the police to come into our communities, but also how does policing in and of itself is not just a product of poverty, but how does it reproduce poverty as well in terms of the fines and the fees and what it means to have a criminal record as an African-American person in these communities. And so I think that all of those issues come together in this document and make it an incredibly powerful intervention and certainly situates it in a lineage of black struggle that has always had an expansive view and understanding of black oppression and has resisted the temptation to reduce black oppression to just this or that aspect of something not working in the system itself, but to have a more whole view of the multiple and multidimensional aspects of black oppression in this society.
Thank you. Derek, concurrently, there's also been the embrace of sort of a model of a black liberation that looks like a replication of capitalism, right? Like, I'm thinking here sort of the Garvey movement and like NOI, like Nation of Islam, like very much focus on not redistributive policies, but like the establishment of essentially of a black ownership class. Can you sketch out that history for us a little bit and then get into the tension between those two traditions?
I'd say that's an excellent question. So sketch out the history. I guess I'm going to take a step back and think about assets in general, because really that's what we're kind of talking about, empowering a community with assets so that they can have self-determination, so that they can truly have freedom to make financial choices and decisions, so that they can have human capabilities, so that they can invest in themselves. There have been several approaches. You pointed out some with the Garveyism, even Nation of Islam with the self-help. I'm going to be slightly critical of that by arguing that it takes assets to build assets. That's the one ingredient that I think might be missing. And if we look through history, I don't think there's been any group of people that have been able to build up their asset capacity without some form of either redistribution or government program or intervention so that they can leverage themselves and pull themselves up by the proverbial bootstraps. So I don't know if I directly answered your question, but I guess quickly to summarize, ultimately one of the things that I'm proud of what this agenda is putting forth, and I also put it in the context of the trajectory in which we were moving. We were moving in what I read to be a paradigm where black people were adopting a neoliberal ideology, the notion of it is true that if you work hard, play by the rules, that you too can get ahead. That was my interpretation of where we were going. And, that was largely my generation where we were, trying to play the game of capitalism. In fact, not revolting against the system because we believed in the system. This new generation I'm very proud of and excited and, feeling a little embarrassed that my generation didn't do enough. But it seems to me like the movement and this was well articulated already, is starting to get it, that there is a need for either some safety or resources themselves so that you can accumulate and grow more resources, and that structures themselves don't just happen, that they don't happen in a vacuum, that there is intentional policy, wealth stripping, et cetera, that lead to these structures. So the new generation is fighting neoliberalism, and I think that's the way to go.
Coming to you, Amani, BYP100 is an organization that very clearly states it operates through a Black queer feminist lens in its organizing. And so what I'm wondering here, because is the rejection of capitalism, because I think that you can say capitalism and heteropatriarchy are two systems that one replicate one another or reproduce one another and are very intimately linked. Is the rejection of capitalism to you tied to a rejection of heteropatriarchy?
Yeah, absolutely it is. I think that one of the things that you have to sort of come into contact with when you're thinking about trying to center the most marginalized people in your communities, right, is the sort of reprioritization of values that sort of entails, right? And so it comes from this understanding that until those of us who have the least access to resources and are the most vulnerable to structural violence are free, then none of us will be. And I think that is part of what makes this movement a little bit different from what we've seen before, is that there has been a reprioritization of the things that we value as sort of signs of progress, right? And so one of the things that I know that we have prioritized a lot, right, is the sorts of labor and the sorts of work, right, that result in intangibles. And when I say that, I mean, I think, right, we always have to be focusing like a lot on numbers, right, in terms of like how many people are we turning out, what sort of policy are we changing, and how are we impacting people's lives. But that's also meant sort of re-examining how we measure progress in general, right? So not just in terms of tangible outcomes, but how are our people doing, right? What is the state of mental health in the Black community, right? You can't talk about that without talking about how Black women and femmes and gender nonconforming folks are the most vulnerable to that type of violence. And so I think that a rejection of capitalism, not just in theoretical terms, but in practice, right? It looks like a reprioritization of values, which means necessarily looking at people who are most impacted by the structural violence that we face. Yeah.
Janae, Keeanga was getting into this a bit, but I want to go to you here. Can you speak to why it's important? You have the agenda for safety, but why it's important also to draw an economic platform for how we address police violence, which is the catalyst for so many of these movements, including the current iteration.
Yeah, it's so necessary to make that connection because of just the sheer fact of how not just, so the prison industrial complex, like that's a big thing. There's like a lot goes into that, but just the way that policing happens, where it happens. We know that hyper surveillance is in the poorest neighborhoods, right? And there are folks looking into this here in New York City as well as Chicago, and I'm sure this is true in other places as well. But there's so many ways that that police are able to be violent and not just get away with it, but profit off of it in different ways. Not just police themselves, but institutions that invest in law enforcement, period, including the same banks that deny Black folks loans, the same banks that, we can't get, that really block us from building the assets that Derek has been talking about. So police brutality bonds is one example, wherein all of the money that is paid out to victims of police violence or their families in cases of killing, those funds are paid out, not out of police budgets or not out of the policemen's pockets, but directly from taxpayers. And the cities have to prioritize paying that back, or they risk, their credit rating. And banks that issue those bonds are able to profit off of the fees, or whether underwriting the bonds and all of that. So like that is just one example of the profit motive. If not only am I able to kill this person, I know the odds are I'm not going to be convicted or even charged, and like everybody wins on that side, right? And just thinking about the many ways that people literally have to pay for their punishment. In the Agenda to Build Black Futures, we cite the story of Marissa Alexander as a prime example. Like, she is still to this day on electronic monitoring, wearing an ankle bracelet, and she has to pay for that every single week. So it's just so many ways that prisons, profit, policing, and punishment they just really reinforce each other. I said this on the Belabored podcast that I did with Sarah Jaffe, that like prisons are essentially the warehouses of the poor. And so there's no way that we can try to build a movement that has been catalyzed by police violence and extrajudicial killings of Black people and vigilantes without making that connection, and without a solid economic program to go along with ending state violence, because we know that state violence takes many different forms. It's not just direct interpersonal behavioral violence, but it really manifests itself in many different ways. So it's my hope that through the Agenda to Build Black Futures, as well as I know there's other policy platforms underway and other groups, I know the Movement for Black Lives is one, that we can just really strategize concretely about how we have these things come to fruition, because the Agenda to Build Black Futures is by no means a strategy manual. It's not a strategy document. It's a starting place, right? And so it's up to us to do that work to figure out how we tackle these systems that have been in place and working so well against us for hundreds of years. So.
Yeah. Coming back around to you, Derek, you're talking about your generation's sort of embrace of neoliberalism as a means of Black liberation, essentially. And I'm wondering what we can attribute that to, right? So and I think that there's sort of an obvious, like, the trappings of capitalism are just very nice, and that's appealing, particularly to people that have been shut out of that economic system and the spoils of capitalism. But also, is the rejection of a sort of socialist outlook tied to the experiences and experiments that we have with socialism here? So, like, we can talk about racism within labor and union movements, or we can talk about and as opposed to wanting to strengthen those, it's a rejection of that and wanting to have like representation within the boardroom or have more Black CEOs. We could talk about the ways in which public housing has been administered. So as opposed to wanting to expand the idea of public housing, we focus on home ownership because public housing has been, dilapidated. Our experience is just these dilapidated houses with, and then our water gets, things like that. Can that be tied to the sort of rejection of socialist politics? And then what do we do in terms of combating that?
So I guess I'm going to start by saying,
if you get the mic.
We hardly practice any pure form of socialism or capitalism, and right. I know that's not the answer you're looking for, no. And we all know that too, right? So I'm going to say that it's somewhat of a misnomer. There's a documentary by Raoul Peck that resonated well with me. What's it called? Profit and Nothing But, right? The Haitian filmmaker. And he starts it out by asking, has capitalism won? I think I thought it was, I'm not critiquing the documentary, but I would rephrase it and say, has capital won? Because frankly, the government still is not practicing capitalism because we choose winners and losers every day through procurement contracts, through our tax policy, et cetera. So, I'm not going to grind ideological bounds of capitalism and socialism. I'm not here to defend capitalism either, for sure. But, there was a perfect storm of neoliberalism that was taking place with the rise of Reagan, the rise of Margaret Thatcher, where they literally had a revolution. So there was money to be made, and there was a lot of people made a lot of money. Inequality expanded, and it tells a nice story, which you pointed out, of if you work hard and play by the rules, you too can be rich. So that's an appealing story. It's appealing to want to think that racism doesn't exist, right? It is psychologically damaging to always think about racism. It creates mental health. So there's somewhat of an incentive to want to engage in a denial. So capitalism has this real appealing story. It's natural. It is efficient. These are the words. It's fair. It's without violence, although we know that's not true. But these are all the narratives around it. So, I think our biggest way forward, it's not as if we don't know policies that we can put forth to address the system and inequality and disparity. It is really addressing that narrative, which you pointed out, I think very eloquent in your question, that capitalism is the way forward and has won. Raoul Peck does it in his film. I think once we get to the point where we can address that narrative and recognize, and I want to say one more thing, going back to assets can take the form of public assets or private assets, right? The point of assets is providing people with the resources so that they can have what Amartya Sen calls human capabilities, the ability to be self-determining in your life, to be able to make choices. Without resources, you can't do that. You're just limited. So we could talk about things like universal college education. That's a public asset. We could talk about baby bonds, which gives people resources so that they can choose to either purchase a home, go to college debt-free, right? Those are private assets. So the manner in which we mechanize it, I think, we can disagree and come up with different alternatives. But the key is addressing that narrative that capital is somehow natural, somehow efficient, somehow even really practiced today when it isn't, because we can go through that in detail. And the second part is giving people the human capabilities with assets at a key point in their life so that they can be self-determining.
Right.
Can I answer?
Yes, please.
Too, because I think that's an important question. And I write about this question of the Black movement and socialism quite extensively throughout my book, but particularly in the final chapter of my book. And I think, in some sense, we have to, for African Americans, for Black people, even beyond the United States, we have to reclaim the socialist tradition in some ways as our own, because I do think that the socialist tradition is a core aspect of the Black radical tradition that we have been separated from, particularly over the last 45 years. And this wasn't through evolution or just a mistake. But at the end of the 1960s, the Black Panther Party was the largest, most influential revolutionary socialist organization in the history of this country. By the early 1970s, the Black Panthers were selling over 200,000 copies of the Black Panther Speaks, their newspaper, on street corners around the United States, that ordinary people who would have looked at would have seen their 10-point platform, which was basically a call for socialism in the United States. And so I think this idea that socialism is some weird white thing that is sort of repellent to Black people or foreign to Black people is a historical lie that we have to untell by going through actually the history over the course of the 20th century, the most influential set of ideas, the politics that Black people around the globe have gravitated to in their struggles for liberation, for national liberation, and to improve their societies have been socialist politics. And it has been in different iterations, and people have had different ideas about that. But the politics of redistribution, of democracy, that the majority of society should be in control of what that society looks like, have been core and key to the Black movement. And I think that we have to reconnect with that history and not concede that history to say that socialism is something that exists outside of Black politics, but socialism is actually bound up with Black politics. And so when we talk about the capitalism and whether or not a previous generation sort of succumbed to neoliberalism, I think in that context we have to talk about the divide that runs through Black America that often is described as a generational divide, but is a class divide. So yes, some people did not give in to neoliberalism, but figured that they could cash in on neoliberalism. There's a whole host of Black elected officials who weren't duped, didn't stumble into neoliberalism. They cashed in on neoliberalism on the backs of Black working class people in the communities that they purported to represent. And so that divide exists in an even more significant way today. We have had a Black president. We continue to have one, a Black attorney general. There are more Black elected officials than at any other point in the history of this country. And yet, still, we have these historic levels of Black deprivation that exist. And I think when we talk about this issue of millennial apathy or however that is described, that those things are not disconnected, that young Black people voted in historic numbers to put Obama in the White House in 2008 and then again in 2012. But when the return is so precious little, right, that if you look over the last 40 years, that the numbers of Black elected officials continues to get higher, but the conditions of the vast majority of Black people either run at an even line or stagnate, then the conclusion that electoral politics is the way to change your condition no longer begins to make any sense. That's not apathy, that's being awake. That's common sense. But that also speaks to the need for a different kind of politics and a different kind of a political alternative to that which exists. And then just the last thing that I'll say really quickly, I think that when we're talking about socialism and capitalism, the one thing that I would say to the comrades in BYP is that we should push even harder for more precision about what it is that we mean. And so if we're talking about racial capitalism as a problem as a problem that exists in the United States, is rooted in the deprivation and poverty that exist in Black communities, then how do we talk about that with public policy? Because the questions of capitalism are often not posed in terms of policy, meaning that if we're talking about capitalism as creating institutional endemic problems for African Americans, is that something that can be voted on? Is that something, can the resolution of that be found in a policy solution? In the same way, can we reform the police through policy? Perhaps people think that we can, and that is a debate that is worth having. But I think that when we use the term revolutionary process, well then what is that? And what is the relationship between a revolutionary process and public policy? And what do those have to do with capitalism? And so in that sense, there's an underlying tension between what can be reformed in the here and now that makes people's lives better in the here and now, which is important, and what can't be reformed and thus raises the questions about a total transformation of society in order to alleviate that particular set of problems.
piece, just to add
Please
like
do.
a little bit of a global perspective. I mean, I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about neoliberalism, and I'm thinking about apathy. I'm thinking about coming from the Caribbean, right? And the post-colonial just reality that we live in, right? And this sort of sense that folks had at the time that a lot of the independent struggles were happening, that we were creating like a new society, right? And the ways in which that kind of fed into this sort of sense that, okay, now we've arrived, you know? And how very clearly that's just not true at this point. And we see that what in actuality happened is that we have the same structures in place, right? That the colonists may have left, but new colonizers from the place itself have taken over. And but I think the point that I don't want to lose as well is that, right, I think you said we don't have a pure model for capitalism, we don't have a pure model for socialism. I mean, like when we talk about independent struggles and the socialism that sort of, sprung up in those countries afterwards, we have to confront the reality that they were violently stamped out, right? You think about a Grenada, you think about a Jamaica, and sometimes it was, in the form of like physical interventions and coups or whatever like that, and sometimes it's policy, right? Like trade agreements and that type of thing. And so just not to get lost that when we talk about apathy, right, it's not as though people were just kind of like stunned and saw like pretty objects, and some of that may have happened, right? But it was very violently wiped out, and so it makes sense, right, that the way that people feel about what's possible for a new society is changed by that,
Yeah. Thank you. I want to go to Imani and Janae, and so we're in this moment, we're in this sort of Bernie Sanders moment, right? And the idea of socialism has gained a certain level of legitimacy among certain segments of the population, and in some respects, the contingent that is the most vocal Bernie supporters have been college-educated white people, and the idea has been, universal policies as opposed to race-specific ones. Now, that's not to paint every Bernie supporter as that, but that's been the most vocal, I think. And that's caused a lot of tension when I think that, particularly between organizations, theorists who focus in on questions of economic justice versus those who are centered in a sort of anti-racist organizing, right? When Agenda to Build Black Future shows me that there's space there that should be space for coalition building, because the economic policies are not that far off. Like there is agreement there, but it's sort of agreement, but you all, I think, take it a step further or incorporate in your analysis things that are absent from other analyses. So my question then is, what would be the criteria for you for that sort of coalition building with organizations that have focused in on economic justice but have not had a Black queer feminist lens to operate through?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying, even though this is called the Agenda to Build Black Futures, what we espousing here is not solely for Black people, right? In taking a Black queer feminist lens, if all of the things that we talk about in this agenda was to be actualized, the whole world would be better off, not just Black people, right? And so, in developing this agenda before anything was like set in stone, we go through a checklist of questions that we have to ask ourselves in terms of these ideas that we're putting out. So does this fall within our Black queer feminist lens? Is this aligned with our values? Because it's very important to us that our policy ideas don't solely start with the problem, but it is definitely value-led, right? And so, in thinking about universal policies versus race-specific policies, I think universalism in a lot of ways signals color blindness, and I think color blindness especially in a white supremacist society, is very dangerous. And so, I tend to err on the side of not necessarily just race-based policy, but more so intersectional policy, because of course we all are made up of different identities. So to have a race-based policy that is absent of how it might affect women or gender non-conforming folks is, it's just as bad, right? And so I'd like to err on the side of a targeted universalism. I forget who coined this term. There you go. Thank you. See, it pays to have academics on the panel. So targeted universalism is essentially this idea of identifying a problem and proposing a solution with the most marginalized population, or the population that is most affected by this problem that you've identified, and then kind of moving out from there to encompass as many people as you can. And these targeted universal policies are ideally preceded by or prefaced with some type of impact statement of how this policy would impact different groups. And so I think that is a much safer way to approach policy making and coalition building, because it still stays true to what I understand our Black queer feminist lens to be, is to center the most marginalized, but not at the expense of everyone else, right? And so coalition building is definitely important, because we're not like achieving liberation, freedom, we can't do that in silos, right? And so that means Black organizations building with other Black organizations, building with Pan-Asian organizations, building with white liberal, all of those things. And so we can still play nice in the stand and build together, and not necessarily all have the same specific ideas or needs. That's why it's so important to lead with values, because if we all share the same values, and the specifics of it all is not as relevant to build with each other to get to a common goal. So I'm here for targeted universalism.
Imani.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think so. Right, depending on how you feel about, when you think about the fact that we live in a world, right, where most people's definitions of humanity, right, in general, stand in direct opposition or depend on the negation, right, of your existence as a Black person, right, then it becomes really hard to understand the ways that coalition can fit within that, right? But I think that Janae kind of really gets at it when she talks about that targeted universalism, that sort of shared understanding of where we stand in relationship to power, right? And not shying away from that. I think that a lot of times when we're doing coalition building, we're asked to pretend as though we all stand in a similar position to power, that we're all on a level playing field, which I think is another sort of but like a product of neoliberalism, where it stands in the tradition of neoliberalism. And I think that would be one of the first things that I would need to be sure of, right? That's not on the table at all when it comes to building coalition. Because I've found that a lot of times when people are talking about this idea of the universal, right, they're not talking about Black people at all. And more than that, they're talking about solutions that depend on the exploitation of Black people and of their disposability, right? And so you think about something like a common slogan, right, in immigration reform, where Black people are routinely erased, right, from that struggle, even though they're disproportionately impacted by it, is that we're workers, not criminals. And looking at a statement like that, to me, I understand that as inherently anti-Black, right? Because it depends on this understanding of criminalization that is objective, that stands outside of a relationship to power, that stands outside of anti-Blackness when it doesn't. And so I think that sort of shared understanding of an analysis of power is important, and I think that the space for Black-led organizations and Black organizations to exist, period, is so important. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the level of insurgency that we've seen in Black freedom movements, right, has also been coupled with or has happened concurrently with a deep commitment to Black organization building. And so I think that in a movement, right, there's a lot of different things that are happening at one time that are necessary. It's a movement ecology of sorts, right? And so I think there needs to be space for, right, an analysis of power that says that Black people need the space to be organizing together, right? And not just for the sake of it, but with very specific values in mind. Even as coalition building, I think, is possible, but not without that sort of understanding of where we stand in relationship to power, right? And the differences between us on that basis.
All right. Derek, you're really excited to get in here, please.
So I want to return a little bit to Barack Obama and then also come back to targeted universalism. Without overwhelming Black turnout and Black support, Barack Obama does not win the DNC primary and doesn't win. He explicitly ran on a neoliberal agenda. He was clear, right? He also ran on a dog whistle Black ideology or what's the word? Identity politics agenda as well, but it was undertoned with a dog whistle. So he was the perfect figure to advance this neoliberal agenda at the crisis moment that the United States faced. We were primed for dramatic change given the calamity that we face. But it was through Black people and a neoliberal agenda that we had the perfect candidate to keep in my normative view, to keep that movement going forward. I'll also return to, I think Amani was spot on in her critique of targeted universalism. And that's my one cautionary tale with targeted universalism, wherein Barack Obama makes this explicit all the time in his work, that there's nothing particular about Black people's struggle, that we all have some struggle, that we all have some marginal status. Black people need to bind their grievances with that of all Americans. These are basically quotes. So he becomes the narrator of this norm, as well as the perfect person in terms of who he represents for capitalism, in my view. I can dissect it if we want, but in the interest of time, I won't. But going back to targeted universalism, I think that there is also some effect that your movement is having on places like Brookings Institute, which is basically a kind of center or right center organization. There have been people there that have been using the word race-conscious policies. And I kind of like that better than targeted universalism. I think targeted universalism is great and for what it means, but I like race-conscious policy because it's explicit. It's saying that we're going to pay attention to race. Even if we're going to have a universal policy, we are explicitly targeting race. And we can do it with several things like criminal justice reform, like wealth, et cetera. But going back to targeted universalism, it very well may feed off of people like William Julius Wilson, who is a purported socialist, at least at one point in his life. I'm not sure if he still identifies as a socialist, but he wrote the book, The Declining Significance of Race, The Truly Disadvantaged, et cetera. And I think in his narrative, he is saying that to a large extent, the civil rights got rid of explicit racism, that race matters to the extent that it is tied up with poverty, to the extent that it's tied up with concentrations of poverty, and that if we were to address poverty, that de facto we can address race. Now, I may be butchering him a little bit, but I think I got the gist of it. To me, that is wrong, and that's not the right way to go. So I think we need to be cautious to make sure we understand that independent of class, there's a strong race component. Independent of other marginal identities, race still remains prevalent and perhaps is the one extreme norm by which the others are, I guess, related to, in which they are marginalized as well. But there is something to Blackness that remains persistent in American history.
And I think that feeds right into this question, and I want to just go around and get everyone's perspective on this. It's touched on in Agenda to Build Black Futures, but how important is reparations to this conversation?
Well, I think the question of reparations is quite important, and there are a few reasons why. The first is that, well, let me just say that I think that one of the important contributions that Ta-Nehisi Coates makes to the debate and question about reparations is to bring it into the 20th century and to situate it as a modern question. And he does so by looking at some of the things that we've talked about earlier, which is really what could be described as the political economy of racial segregation, or the political economy of racism, of poverty in the United States. And basically the way in which private institutions facilitated by the state have grown rich off of segregation and the misery of Black people in some ways, and also sort of expanding our understanding of segregation as beyond the question of whether or not white people want to live next to Black people, but understanding how segregation creates the conditions for the predation of Black people, that it creates the conditions for the economic exploitation of Black people. And so in that sense, there's a debt to be paid based on the intense ways that economic exploitation has taken part across Black communities. And in some ways, it is repaid without being called reparations. And so if you look at the mortgage scandals and subprime lending and the ways that banks that were complicit in this, which is all of them, were forced through federal lawsuit to repay money that was illegally extracted out of Black neighborhoods as a result of fraud and corruption in the mortgage lending business, in some sense is an aspect of reparation, but without the political component to it, which I think is also important, which is to name the debt and name the reason why the debt is being repaid. And politically, part of the reason why I think that reparations is actually critical is because it raises it has the potential to raise and institutionalize and center the oppression and exploitation of Black people as being the centerpiece of American history in a way that is just not understood in this country, and in a way that I think can actually contribute and strengthen the political movements that are focused on economic issues right now. And just to end, because I do think that if we look at something like the Sanders campaign, I think from where it began to where it is now shows the impact of Black organizing and the struggle in a way that I think reparations can have a similar effect, which is to say that when the Sanders campaign started, I think that there was almost no discussion about about the way that racial inequality intersects with economic inequality, and as is clearly stated in the agenda here, that you can't have one without the other. So the idea that you can just sort of drop the issue of racial inequality and expect to have economic equality in the United States is impossible. But I think that as an impact of direct actions that were directed at Sanders, but also the movement itself, that it has forced his campaign to deal with the question of race. It's inadequate in many ways, it's incomplete in many ways, but his racial justice platform is really, I have not seen as sort of mainstream candidate with a platform that is that comprehensive. It is not fully integrated into his public appeals and speeches and all of that, but that it actually exists means that there is some level of engagement, and that is the power, I think, of elevating the history of the Black movement, its relationship to the contemporary struggles against racism, and I think that the whole question of reparations can play a key role in that politically, in addition to actually dealing with the debt that is owed to Black people.
So I'm going to agree and also point out another area that, this Black Lives Matter movement should take credit for. They really have pushed Bernie Sanders to at least be cognizant of race and attempt to address it, however imperfect it might be. But I certainly would not have imagined that we would see some of the things that are taking place in a major political candidate. So, I also applaud Bernie Sanders for having the integrity to listen at least and attempt to address it. But going back to the question of reparations, I'd also agree and say that it is important and something that should remain on the agenda. I think that it can address both material consequence as well as psychological consequence. It should accompany both acknowledgement and an apology. I think that step is not trivial, to acknowledge that this harm has been done. And we can think about specific acts, so we can make it, we can talk about it in a theoretical or practical sense. So Ta-Nehisi Coates has done a lot of this work, but as have others. We can tie it in directly to slavery. We could talk about Jim Crow, where we have state-sanctioned segregation and resource deprivation. We can go on. One could even make an argument about the foreclosure crisis as being a harm that could be redressed with reparations. So I think that it is important to acknowledge, to get the apology. That gives dignity. A lot of the stuff we've been talking about is loss of dignity within Black people. That apology is important for dignity purposes. They also should be redressed. And we can come up with practical redress. There are people, we do it all the time. Anytime we have litigation, tort cases, we define what the value is of a whole lot of things. So there are very skilled economists that would be very capable of coming up with how we could redress the harmful conditions that have taken place in the past. I'll give a shout out to William Darity and Kirsten Mullen, who are working on a book on reparations that will provide a lot of these answers. And then the final part, and the conservatives may agree with this as well, I think they probably would, and this is often the argument put forth against reparations, move on. That if this is done and done correctly in a suitable fashion, I don't think the redress from the banking industry was suitable enough, so we should move on, and I don't think you do either. But so that's not the reparations I'm explicitly talking about, but if it's done correctly, Black people move on. That doesn't mean race is over in the U.S., doesn't mean that we don't have any more claims against inequality and redistribution, but that would be the point of reparations, that is supposed to be somewhat of a healing act. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, so reparations is absolutely, I think, important to this conversation, and I think a huge reason why we kind of lead this document with that point. I mean, it's right after the introduction, and because I kind of see reparations as kind of this umbrella under which kind of all of our other policy proposals fall under, because all of the problems that we assert are a product of some of the systemic harms that we've been talking about. And so in addition to, the foreclosure crisis and slavery and Jim Crow, I mean, there are more recent phenomena that we can point to too in terms of mass incarceration. There are people that are still serving time for being sentenced under the 100-to-1 crack cocaine disparity that, it's been overturned, but they're still serving time for being sentenced under that, right? And all of the collateral consequences that happen as a result of being incarcerated and being swept up in the war on drugs specifically, not just for the people incarcerated, but their families. We can talk about when eugenics was at an all-time high, and when there was a lot of vigilance around population control, how Black women were sterilized without their knowledge in a lot of states. Like, there are so many things, so much harm that has been done, that an apology is just where we start. Just acknowledge that these things have happened, and that we would be so much farther along, for lack of a better way of saying it, had these things not happened. And so, yeah, I really do think that the agenda to build Black futures kind of falls within a reparations framework in that we don't need to view reparations as this like separate thing that we're calling for, but recognizing that redress can look a lot of different ways depending on the subpopulation that you're talking about, the problem that you're addressing, what amends are being made, right? And so, we mentioned in here the torture survivors of John Burge. Reparations for them looks different from reparations for women who were sterilized without their knowledge. So we really just have to be, like you mentioned earlier, just specific about what we want and the harms that have been done in order to really advocate for it. And so like reparations doesn't have to be like one broad sweeping like federal thing that's like handed down from national government, but like reparations could be as local as a city ordinance, or a state bill. It could just definitely take many different forms. And so, I mean, we make a couple of suggestions in the agenda, but I do definitely think that sky's the limit in terms of like how it's actually played out or implemented rather.
So definitely, just to echo what some folks have said, I think reparations is something that is definitely necessary and important to the conversation. Just thinking back to your first question, right, about how heteropatriarchy relates to capitalism, right? I think that one thing that you can definitely say is that the world in this society specifically revolves around, is built on not just Black labor and disposability, Black femme labor and disposability in particular. And I think that when you're thinking about that, it really starts to, you have to think about what it is that justice means to you, basically, right? What does justice mean to you? I say all the time, like if I believed that a cop going to prison was gonna keep Black kids safe, then I would be all for it, right? But that's not what I believe, right? And so when I think about reparations, I think about another thing that people are, frequently sort of talk about as though we're a fairy tale in a similar way, which is abolition. And I think about the fact that there are so many resources that are devoted not just to like actually exploiting and suppressing Black people, but the experimentation. You know what I mean? Like developing tools of technology to actually do that and carry it out. And I think about what the world could look like if we had a similar amount of resources to sort of envision or build a world that we've actually never seen before, right? We're trying, what it would mean if we had the resources to build a freedom that we've never seen, right? And I think that there are a lot of ways that we don't know what the end point of that would be, but I think we know what some starting points would be. And I think that it starts with centering the folks who have borne the brunt of the violence and the exploitation that the creation of this world has necessitated. And I think that when we talk about like building Black futures and funding Black futures, I mean, a lot of times the thing that comes right before that is defund the police, defund prisons, right? And so when I think about justice, when I think about reparations, when I think about abolition, I'm thinking about where are resources right now, right, that are actually contributing to our direct and continuing and ongoing exploitation and just the gratuitous violence that Black people face? Where are they right now, and where could they be? And where could they be if they were being, and what could happen if they were being used in the service of a Black radical imagination that was committed to protecting the most vulnerable among us, right? And so when I think about reparations, I agree. I think it could look like a lot of different things, but I think that the importance of that value has to be there, right? What does justice mean to us in this context, in a world where we've been subject to pain and damage that can literally, we cannot get ourselves, you know what I mean, back, you know what I mean? That's not the type of thing that you can measure in a sort of like one-to-one way. And to me, a lot of the way that I think about reparations is the use of resources in the service of a Black radical imagination. And I think that's why it's so important to be talking about all the time.
All right.
Can I just add something really, really quick? Just Imani talking about resources. This maybe not directly tied to reparations, but when we say, stop the cops, fund Black futures, when we say defund the police and fund Black futures, it's tied to like literally like how our money is spent, like how our budgets are set up. And I'm thinking about the idea of participatory budgeting, and like how do we make the way our resources, because a lot of our budgets, whether it's city, state, federal, whatever, are funded through our tax dollars, right? And so we should have more of a say of how that money is spent. And just thinking about just Chicago, where I live, for example, almost 40% of our budget goes towards policing. And so what does it look like, or what can democracy look like in terms of us saying, no, actually, we should reduce this, reallocate it to this. It makes no sense for the police to get that much of have that huge chunk of our budget when we have like whole community or whole blocks of like vacant homes, where we have like schools that have metal detectors but no librarians. But like it's crazy. So I really want to think about one, interrogating what public safety looks like, because for many people that I know, it does not look like squad cars sitting on their block 24/7. It doesn't look like, community policing even. Officer friendly, that's still not public safety to many people. So really interrogating what public safety is and how can we build a people's budget versus, what people who are totally disconnected from the problems that we experience dictating how our resources are spent.
Yes. All right. Now we're going to open it up for questions. No questions? Did they just blow your minds? Do we have a question?
Yeah, stand up.
Just, yeah.
Is a form of what? Race-conscious policy.
Rent control as a race-conscious policy. What do we think of that?
Frankly, I don't think it's played out that way in New York City. When I have colleagues that have a rent control department who are professors in maybe I'm talking too much, but where if you have housing discrimination a priori, whoever gets access to that rent control in and of itself could be distributed in a race-conscious way, but not the race-conscious way that we're talking about. So in theory, perhaps you could devise one that would be race-conscious, but I don't believe that the one in New York City that's currently practiced is race-conscious.
There's no race-conscious policy unless there's a race-conscious policy. I mean, I think part of what we're saying is that it must be clearly articulated, and the assumption can't be because Black people or other ethnically or racially oppressed people are overrepresented in a category that if a policy that addresses that issue is implemented, that it will magically just lead to also having a disproportionate impact on Black people. That the way that race and discrimination works in this society is that unless it is explicit, Black people tend to get left out of those policies. So I think that's the rub.
To be clear, I meant
Could be.
Definitely no.
Yeah.
New York City is not.
Potentially.
It can't be unless it is specifically articulated that X policy. We need quotas, because if you can't count, you have no idea whether or not something is actually working. And that's part of the problem in terms of the ground that has been seeded on this by the Democratic Party, by liberals, is this the means by which we can actually count and judge whether or not policies or practices work have been stripped out of the discussion. So we can't talk about quotas. We can't have numerical categories that say X number didn't exist on this day, it now exists today. And so without the ability to count, it's impossible to determine whether or not a policy is implemented in a race-conscious way or not. And so I think that's one of the things, our broad movement has to take up again as well.
one other way you can do it, I agree with the quotas, but you can make something a right and really implement it where everybody has, you know, everybody has decent housing in New York City. That's a right, and we truly adhere to it. That's another way to make it race conscious.
Question right here.
Hi, you discussed dealing with our political party leaders on a macro level in regards to having them do what they need to do when it comes down to racism and classism. How do we, as a community, begin to, let's say, put pressure on our political leaders, on our assemblymen, on our congressmen in order to do that? Because far too often, and I know this is in Brooklyn, we are never in contact with them. We don't know about policies that come on the floor. There's no indication that there's a forum being held on zoning, that there's something being held on school. They're not giving us that information so that we can become involved. The only thing we get to see is when it happened and the next day it's implemented. For example, they changed the zoning in my neighborhood some time ago without the information being accessible to the people within that community board. As a result, it has now fluctuated to a community where there's constant revitalization that doesn't, support the economy or the people of that community. Thus, we're being pushed out. How do we get them on a micro level to come out, get up out of Washington, and come down and see what's going on?
I think that's a great point. So while I can't speak specifically to Brooklyn or New York City, I can definitely say that, folks within and outside of my organization have no problem going to City Hall and bird dogging a city council meeting. Like, and I do agree, it's very hard to stay abreast of all of the specifics that happen on a municipal level. And we do have to work extra hard to find out what those things are. And so I think part of that is just like a robust self-education as well as within our communities about like where to look and like know who our council people are, know who our local representatives are, where their offices are, because likely they don't live far from you, likely their office is not far from you, their phone number is listed somewhere, and I mean, organizers, so I know agitation. I know like direct action. Like that's what I'm thinking about. But you can, I'm sure there has to be some type of, town hall forums, something. I don't know. I don't know if you can speak to New York City specific landscape, but like we do have to do too much legwork. But it's possible.
Yeah, so somebody who grew up here could probably speak a little bit more clearly to it, but from what I've noticed here, what I've seen, I guess, of sort of the way local politics tends to work here is that there are all these sort of local representations of like local government, basically, right? You've got community boards, you've got different bodies, basically, that claim that if you spend your energy in them, right, and if you dedicate or you devote your time or your focus to them, that you will have a real impact on what happens in a level of government that's just above you, right? And I think that what I've seen in a lot of community boards, and just talking to a lot of folks who attend community boards, is that that's not really what they feel. They don't necessarily feel that being on the community board has a real impact on whether or not, a rezoning happens in their neighborhood. What it does is, they say you can make a suggestion. You can spend hours and hours having a debate about whether or not this should happen or if it should happen with certain caveats, but at the end of the day, it's a recommendation. And so I think like one of the things, right, you're talking to the two people who decided to join an organization, so you're gonna get a slightly biased answer, but I think that there's a real power to community organizing that recognizes that this is not where our energy is best served, right? And that there needs to be a more direct confrontation with power that's outside of a prescribed channel if we're going to be taken seriously as constituents who can vote for you. And so, yeah, I think, just to echo what Janae said, it comes down a lot to sort of identifying where your power is, and I think a lot of the times it's with the people who are most affected by what it is you're talking about, and not necessarily in the channels that people in power give you to air those grievances to no end.
Yeah. I mean, and to that point, just to end that, local politics relative to state and federal politics is actually like more accessible and easier to impact, because you can say, like, I am literally your constituent, I live in your district or your ward or however it's divided, and I have the power to not vote for you, and me and my base, whoever that base might be, it could be a group of your friends, and go to your local politician's office and say, this is a problem for us, or whatever the grievance is, and it means a lot more. You have a lot more leverage on the local level and hyper local level than you do in the meso and macro levels that we've been talking about.
I think for Kings County, which is Brooklyn, that's the most Democratic county in the country. So, one concern is, do we have alternatives? I know personally, I'm no longer, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote this essay that influenced me. Probably many of you might have read it in this room. I no longer choose the lesser of two evils when I vote. Mm-hmm. If I have to write in a third party, I will, or I'll choose the third party candidate. So, in New York, there is the Workers' Family Party as an alternative. There's the Green Party as an alternative. But maybe we need to come up with our own candidates that are going to represent us and let us know about ordinances and really represent the will of the people.
Question right here.
Hey, my name's Aaron. Thanks for this discussion, this conversation, this forum. It's obviously powerfully, incredibly important and relevant. I wanted to kind of ask a follow-up question to the question regarding the sort of divide between like Black movements and kind of socialist politics, and ask how ask if there's a relationship between that sort of division and a lot of say, and this kind of speaks to some of what Keeanga-'s written in her book and her articles regarding black faces in high places and the limits of that, where you had in the 60s many radicals and revolutionaries enter into the Democratic Party and then run for office and then become actual administrators of neoliberalism. In the case of I'm thinking, I'm from Detroit, where we had, say, Coleman Young, who had, many was involved in, say, the unionization efforts of UAW in the CIO, and was an affiliate of the Communist Party, who then became, mayor of Detroit, who then, actively led the effort to clear out, say, Coal Town in order to make room for General Motors, who, comes to hire, 10,000 workers and only ended up hiring 2,000 or something like that, right? Or, again, in Detroit, where you have, say, people like, Ken Cockrell Jr., who's the son of Ken Cockrell, who is one of the leaders and co-founders of the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, who then helps to administer the bankruptcy of Detroit. Or even Ken Cockrell's partner, Sheila Cockrell, who very directly spoke out in favor of it, right? And there's many examples of this. And I'm wondering if there's, if that can also be, say at least one contour of that separation, that forcible separation of socialist politics from racial justice and Black radicalism today.
Yeah.
That's you. He called you by name.
Yes. Yeah. No. I do think that for some people who were especially prominent in the movement as radicals and revolutionaries, who then sort of turned into the Democratic Party, that there's some aspect of that's true. Although I do think that at the end of the 60s, that there was a way in which entering into electoral politics seemed like a logical conclusion, because we were Black people are concentrated in cities with white political machines that everyone recognized as part of the antagonism that was part of the provocation resulting in these urban rebellions. And so even the most radical, someone like Bobby Seale from the Black Panther parties, or as exemplified through there's this big political convention in Gary, Indiana in 1972 in which revolutionaries and electoral figures Black electoral figures within the Democratic Party met together to map out something akin to an agenda for a Black future. And there was much more fluidity between those politics, which in retrospect was deeply problematic, because you can't both advocate for the complete social upheaval of a particular kind of society by saying that racism is endemic to capitalism, and thus Black suffering is central to capitalism, and yet at the same time try to figure out a political strategy that doesn't actually challenge the system. I mean, you can do that, but they were both contradictory positions that ultimately led that formation into a cul-de-sac that they weren't able to figure out, because there were two polar opposite strategies. One of, Manning Marable says the central tension in Black history is that between accommodation and resistance. And so that was borne out quite acutely there. And I think the more sort of the sharp edge of the neoliberal aspect of that Black political agenda gets borne out in the 1980s when you get, finally Black people in charge of the machinery of the cities. While the tax base has left, the cities are broke, there's a recession, there's 20% Black unemployment, and there's no plan except these kind of neoliberal boondoggle waterfront projects that are not really sustainable programs for economic development. And so I think, in some ways this raises lots of questions about what it is that we're actually fighting for, what is possible to be attained in the existing society that we live in, and then what is not, and what does that mean for the type of movement that we are actually trying to build? Can we build a genuine movement for Black freedom in capitalist America? It was a question posed in the 1960s, and I think it went unanswered, it was unresolved, and the movement now is confronting, I think, many of those same questions.
I want to add just a little bit to that. Those are huge questions to be answered, and I don't have the answers. But in thinking about BYP100 specifically, the reason why civic engagement is kind of one of our prongs, or as a part of our theory of change and how we organize, is I think the long-term goal of independent political power, because when we do civic engagement or electoral organizing, I mean, it's not around endorsing candidates at all. We don't do that. But what we do is, outside of having what I see as really transformative conversations with people who might be apathetic to electoral organizing, or just like encouraging folks to vote, getting pledges to vote. We're at the same time collecting data from these people, because we target our base, which is like young Black folks, 18 to 35, not exclusively, but that is who we're targeting. So when I say that we collect data, like not just, name, whatever, but like what issues do you care about, right? And really building a database of like the more young Black folks that we touch as a base building organization, we can mobilize around those issues that folks care about, right? And if the base is strong enough and civically engaged, so to speak, that gives way to a better opportunity to run a candidate on a third party and that focuses on those issues, or has the agenda to build Black futures, which is a policy platform, to be a political platform, and have it be a much viable campaign to an elected office, because it is issue-based directly from interacting with our people. And so, I don't have the answers to assuage the tension between, socialist ideals in the Democratic Party and just this idea of a two-party system, period. But I do know that, like, I and like organizationally, and I think, as a movement, we should have our eyes on the long-term game of like building political power outside of the two-party system that is reflective of and sensitive to our issues, and doing that through base building and civic engagement.
And I think I got time for one more question. There, yeah, Asha.
So I think this conversation around both electoral organizing and civic engagement, and then also talking about reforms in terms of the criminal justice system, in terms of police, that relate to economic justice. I'd like to hear from all the panelists, as well as specifically Janae and or Imani, around how we can understand a politic for or an economic politic around reparations as it relates to abolition, and that being like a project of abolition that we can understand Black people being a part of, from slavery to potentially police invasion and potentially to capitalism, and just like talking about on the ground how those two things relate in terms of what kinds of campaigns, what kinds of demands, and what kind of power really that young Black people are trying to build now. Is that clear?
Is that clear for everyone?
Taking power away from systems and building a new form of power that's functioning in a different way, and what are some like kind of just concrete examples of how that's playing out now, and how that can look?
Yeah, I think power relations is always a central question, or at least should be a central question in any type of policy demand and or campaign development. Specifically with reparations, as we said earlier, reparations can take many different forms, and any form that does take it should put us in it shouldn't be like a temporary, here you go, you should be happy now, handout or whatever. It should actually like substantively transform our relationship to power, like Imani said earlier. And so in thinking within an abolitionist framework, for example, one thing that we mentioned in the agenda to build Black futures is like re-enfranchising or restoring voting rights to folks who are incarcerated, just for example, right? And so there was actually just a court ruling today that ruled prison gerrymandering as unconstitutional, and I won't go off on that tangent, but if upon restoring voting rights, at the same time we're talking about how to decarcerate, and if we're talking about divesting from punishment and investing in our futures, what can we invest in that would make it less likely or make the conditions better for those who are returning from prison to not return? How do we build out alternatives to incarceration? How do we strengthen conflict resolution within communities? Those are all things that we should be thinking about in terms of making decarceration sustainable, to a point where we don't have to rely on prisons and jails as a primary or knee-jerk reaction to harms done in the community. Because in thinking about just putting someone away in a cage, a prison, or jail, it really takes away, actually, the opportunity for redress in the community. It takes away the opportunity to, to foster or directly address harm that was done. And so, yeah, just really thinking about putting the divestment, investment, community control ideals all together, I think definitely happens within an abolitionist framework. I mean, that's just one example, to use the incarcerated folks. I don't know if folks have anything to add to that.
Tackle this pretty quickly.
Want me to go? Okay. I'd say I love the frame of reparations in the context of disparities more broadly. I'm going to try to adopt it because I definitely learned a lot from it, and that whole framing is very useful. Obviously, the but is, I see, and maybe this is my economist hat, I see reparations in a practical sense defined in terms of specific redress. And there's undeniable many examples of redress, of examples of egregions directed at black people that need to be redressed through history, but I think they need to be decoupled. So I think when designing a reparations in a practical sense for slavery, it should target slavery, and that's going to influence who's eligible for it. Not every black person would be eligible for reparations for slavery in my normative view. But then we can fast forward to Jim Crow South. You'll get a different set of black people that might be eligible. You can talk about the mortgage crises, and if we're going to talk about the foreclosure crisis and predatory lending, you'll get another set of black people that might be specifically harmed. So I think the specifics of it, if we're going to, and I think we really can come up with practical reparations and implement it. I think that we will need some specificity. I like the idea that reparations can take many forms. Before I talked about public and private assets, I do like the component of getting a check. I think that I want a damn check. But in addition to a check, there are things you can build up institutions. You can build up HBCUs. You can come up with grant programs like a Marshall Plan, et cetera, et cetera. We can keep going of the ways in which you can distribute reparations. There's one thing to be cognizant of if you're going to do a reparations program. Black people don't really own the means of production. So people who've done development economics, they've talked, we have North-South models where the South is usually described as a developing country, the North as a hegemonic country. You could actually make the hegemonic country better off through a system of reparations, largely because of the terms of trade. If the South country doesn't own the means of production, you can ultimately stimulate the dominant country or the hegemonic country where they end up even relatively better off than where they began. So we should be careful. I would like for reparations to include some form of ownership of the means of production if we're going to stay with a private asset model. Again, we can go with a public asset model to address that as well. I'm going to try to wind it down by saying one last thing, which is in terms of voting and how we could, movement and everything like that, this is a little tongue-in-cheek. I used to say that Barack Obama was going to break black people's heart. I never really, I thought he was clear in saying these things. I was wrong. He didn't break, his support didn't dwindle despite what I perceived to be neoliberal policies where disparity actually increased under his watch. But now, again, the tongue in cheek, it probably is not going to go over well on this audience. Black people kind of broke my heart, especially in the South, the way we just gave up that vote pretty easy. I think that we ultimately made, we are deciding the DNC, a person who's going to come out. Now, maybe that's the wrong way to go. Maybe we need to come up with a revolution through other means. But we ultimately are, in my opinion, going to put the next president in the White House, and we put the previous president in the White House in the primary. And we kind of gave it up with little. So I wish we were perhaps more strategic in the vote. So that is, Bernie Sanders to me is hitting he is as imperfect as he is coming at the issues, I believe, with a sense of integrity. I believe him, and again, these are my normative views. And he also is talking about rights. He is talking about things like the college as a right, healthcare as a right. And to me, those are potentially race-conscious policies, but I certainly am not abandoning race-specific policies as well.
Let me just, I know we're at time, but let me just say a couple of things. The future of black people will not be decided at the ballot box in the United States, because when you're talking about transforming the lives of some of the most oppressed people in the United States, then you're talking about the need to transform the political economy of the United States. The entire way this country is structured is dependent on the subjugation of Black people, on immigrant populations, on the racially and ethnically oppressed people of this country. There are 20 million poor white people in this country. And so some of the things that we're talking about are questions that cannot be resolved legislatively. I teach public policy at Princeton, and I tell all my classes, public policy is shit. What matters is what matters are the social movements, because social movements, political movements, are what determine whether or not there's a good policy that actually responds to the needs of people or not. And even if you get something like that into legislation or into writing, the minute that movement is off the streets, the pressure to roll back and to take away whatever we have gained it comes back to the fore. And so what I think that we have to talk about are short-term and long-term goals. What are the things that we have to do in the here and now that can make people's lives better? A $15 minimum wage, decriminalization of marijuana, all these nuisance bullshit crimes, all of these small attacks that happen to people every day that we can change the legislation around. But there are bigger questions. We're talking about the means of production, or we're talking about making housing a right, or we're talking about this wonderful worker bill of rights for workers. You can't vote on that in this country. That is not something that is up for us to decide on. That is something that has to come through some major revolutionary political change, which then means that we have to talk about what kind of revolutionary process are we talking about, and not confuse that with things that you can vote for. I saw this quote the other day from Lucy Parsons, who was an anarchist and a revolutionary in the 8-hour day movement in the 19th century. And she said, don't ever believe that rich people will let you vote on what to do with their wealth. And that is what we're talking about. When you're talking about universal child care, universal health care, universal bill, that is dealing with capital, capital's wealth. Capital does not put that on the ballot box. We don't get to decide on that in terms of the electoral system. And so that's a much bigger question about how do we get the means of production? How do we flip the calculus from the 1% controlling the resources to the 99% controlling the resources? And that's also part of the discussion that we need to have. Thanks.
We're going to end it there. Thank you to Imani, Janae, Derek, Keeanga for their time and their brilliance. Thank you to Natasha from Dissent, Asha from BYP100, and Jesse Meyerson for organizing this event. Thank you to Verso Books for the space. Thank you to all of you for coming out tonight, and free the land.
Also, if y'all want to fund Black Futures, we got some Black Future merchandise over there. Support, fund Black Futures, please.
Black Future merch.
Yes, literally fund Black Futures.
Please, literally and figuratively.
Wow, I enjoyed myself.
Thank you all. That was incredible. That was incredible. Thank you all so much.